Recording. Okay. Potatoes. So very briefly to like refresh ourselves a tiny bit. Book seven. Well, like in the last meeting, we talked about the allegory of the cave. We talked about forms, and then we talked about under the divided line, stuff like that. About reason, about how we can access the forms, mathematical truths, etc., etc. In um, book seven. Where's this book? Yeah, no, book eight. I mean, we're doing book eight, nine, 10. So in book eight, Plato outlines four types um of like societies or of ways to rule a city. Um, and at the very top, the best one we have is this ideal city, right? The city that they're trying to come up with, the just city, the perfect city. Whether or not it's possible to have this city like in the real world, very unlikely because it's basically like a perfect representation of all the forms, perfect education, all that type of stuff, which isn't really possible in the real world. And I think at one point even like practically the king of what was it the king of Syracuse asked Plato himself to try and set up this ideal city in Greece. It ended up failing. It didn't work out. I think he tried like twice, but they tried to set up this city. It didn't work out. They couldn't get the education properly. People didn't like it. Democracy kind of took over again. But then we have so at the top we have this ideal city in book eight. Then we have the timocracy, and the timocracy is basically a city where what's valued the most is honor. It's where the guardian class ends up caring or taking over, and they care more about honor, about the spirited part of the soul, the thumos. They put that at the highest, and it's very like individual. So they're kind of prioritizing honor over wisdom, and it's wisdom and reason that should be in this ideal city. And then you can like it starts degrading after that, after the democracy, which is like one rung down from the ideal city. It turns into or can turn into an oligarchy, and then an oligarchy is a city in which the focus or the what's valuable is having material possessions, money, wealth, stuff like that. Not so much about uh, reason, wisdom, honor. It's more about how wealth is the measure of success, how and then it creates this sort of like rift in the society between like the rich and the poor, and then that will cause a bunch of like downstream issues ruled by necessary desires, things like yeah, taking care of your repetitive soul, um, nice food, nice cars, and so on. Then it can degrade even further into the democracy, the world we're living in, and then the democracy is, as we know, it's like power of the people, majority rules, freedom is the greatest thing, and so on. He doesn't like that. That's not very good. And then at the absolute bottom, the crappiest type of city is the tyrannical city or the tyranny, where it's complete, where it's complete chaos, and it's just one strong ruler kind of imposing his strength over everyone else, manipulating people. Uh, his soul is enslaved basically, and so on. So he like kind of outlines those four types of cities. Then in book nine, he compares the tyrannical soul versus the philosopher's soul, um, where the tyrannical soul is it's like enslaved by irrational desires, um, where the person is always in fear in one way or another, where a person is always enslaved by his appetites. So it's just like a hot pot of fear and appetites. So the poor tyrannical guy, he's just always having psychological issues, ethical issues, and so on. The compares that to like the philosopher's happiness, where reason um, kind of like can put his whole soul in harmony, and so on. Then he talks about three types of pleasures. We have the appetitive pleasures, so pleasures of the body, sex, food, so on. Then those of the spirit, that which the democracy is kind of concerned of, the 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 pleasure of honor, right? Like the thumos, and then you have the pleasure of the rational, like wisdom, thinking, reason, the philosophers stuff, the stuff that he likes. And then he also talks a little bit about how justice isn't just for keeping like cohesive society; it's for keeping your soul cohesive and in harmony without justice, not only does a society collapse, but your soul kind of collapses and degrades itself. And then at the very, very end, he talks about how we should censor Homer a little bit, censor poetry. We need to be very careful because some of those like acts of like Achilles and those great warriors that were very honor driven, they might be mimicked by the population. That would kind of lead to some crappy stuff. Then he talks about the immortality of the soul, something I really like. I think I wrote a paper on it. It's in publishing, but that one, it's all about how he kind of makes some arguments as to why we have the soul, why why we have this eternal soul, how there might be some sort of an afterlife, and he kind of explains that with the myth of air. The myth of air being a myth where they're basically it's like a narrative of like an afterlife where air, who's a warrior, he comes back from death, and then he says that he had this like vision of an afterlife where each soul is kind of judged, and then they're asked what type of life they want to live in the next life, so a type of like reincarnation almost myth. Um, and he tries to just kind of like nail down the point that it's important to live a just life because there might be afterlife repercussions and so on. And then that's basically all there was for anyone and
I mean, nice summary. I really like these later chapters quite a lot. I was kind of bored at first, but it's really like ramped up.
yeah, I feel like they flow really well because he goes from like he talks about the how a city can be, and he very quickly does it and like very cleverly. He goes how the city can be organized and then how the soul can be organized. And another cool thing is that it seems that each interlocutor in this dialogue represents one of these things. So like Glaucon would represent like the democracy because he's like the brave guy. He's always talking about war or like swords or honor. Um, so he can be like the democratic, and then you have Adiamantus, who like in book four mentioned like he wants wealth, or like mentioned how it's important to have wealth. So he could be like the oligarchic. And then who was it at the very very beginning of the book? Polemarchus, I think. He's like he wants to like convince Socrates to come hang out with him or like come discuss at that old man's house. I forget the name. But he's like, let's put it to a vote. So then he can be like the democratic man. So he like compares, and at the end of this book, I feel like he does like it flows so nicely. It goes from like comparing the way the city can be arranged, the way a soul can be arranged, and then each interlocutor kind of like mimics that.
Yeah, and I think a lot of his criticisms still like people still even like say the things today like democracy leads like can fall into tyranny. Like that's like a natural progression that a lot of people talk about, especially if you're a Marxist, I guess.
Yeah, it's pretty intuitive.
Yeah.
It's like that's the next step
Yeah.
of democracy, or at least it's what we always see or like hear about. How would you define a tyrant?
Yeah.
Do you think Plato does a good job at defining a tyrant, like the way it's understood?
I think it defines what his life is gonna be like pretty good. Pretty indulgent and also paranoid.
Yeah, it does seem very paranoid. Um, just like super afraid all the time, always looking behind your back, like looking over your shoulder. I mean,
Yeah, I mean a lot of like world leader tyrants have had like multiple assassination attempts against them, you know. I would be pretty paranoid too.
yeah, yeah. What differentiates the tyrant from just like a democratic leader, other than like actions wise? Like, are their actions the same, or are they a little bit different? Because like Plato talks about the difference in the soul, like what's on the inside of all of these uh leaders. But like, would their actions be a little bit different?
Well, I mean, I would assume democracy in some sense is supposed to be ruled by the people, right? Like we just pick you're supposed to pick a representative of the people. I would feel like it would be less paranoid, but you know, it doesn't really turn out that way.
Yeah. Otherwise, we wouldn't
It's
have
yeah,
bulletproof glass on all the limos that the prime ministers or presidents
right.
run around in.
Right. You'd think that the people who elect the man actually want him there, but
Hmm.
it gets I mean, it's never that simple.
Yeah, no, I think the line is super blurred nowadays with uh, this like tyranny and a democracy.
Yeah, there's a lot of tension.
Yeah. I don't know if I like, or at least it's not very intuitive for me to put an oligarchy before or like as better than a democracy. Seems a bit off to me.
Hmm.
Because like at least democracy is concerned with freedom. That seems like kind of a good thing.
Maybe he's kind of like reversing the dialectic, like descending backwards type of thing. You know?
Hmm. Yeah, he is working in reverse.
Yeah. So he just sees if that's a because again, dialectics are progressions. So if he's seeing a progression downwards, then the last progression must be like the worst of the dialectic.
Yeah, there's like the tyranny at the bottom. Then he talks about then the democracy
Right.
comes above that, and then above that is the oligarchy. I feel like that's I don't know. I would swap both of those.
I guess too, he
Like
doesn't really
like not
talk about how it reverses, does he? Like
yeah.
how you could go from tyranny back up. He doesn't really talk about that.
No, he doesn't. That's a good point. Can it, or is it irreversible? Do you just need to
Or
like start?
maybe it's like a cycle where it goes all the way back up to the best form again.
Yeah, I found it really interesting. He talked, and it reminded me a lot of like friends or like people I know when he talked about like the oligarchic matter. Like in an oligarchy, they're very thrifty, right? So they're like, always concerned with like
Mhm.
saving money and like and that in itself is kind of a virtue, but like for the wrong reasons,
Hmm.
like accidental virtues.
Telling Ori to get in here.
Oh yeah,
But
I'm wearing my Plato shirt.
yeah, you got the Plato shirt. We're talking about the last books. Like, this is exciting.
Super exciting. I know that Ori doesn't like the idea of what was it that he doesn't think that the soul is immortal, or there's what was it? I don't know. He hated the idea of, or was it like reincarnation?
Are you talking about the last discussion or
Maybe one
which
before,
one?
but there was one point.
Well, I know he hits on about recollection.
Yeah, like does the soul recall? Yeah,
Yeah, and it seems in the later dialogues there isn't a place for it. He also talks about how in Meno, when it's brought up that Socrates himself is kind of like, "Hey, why aren't you guys like arguing against this point?"
yeah,
You know. So I mean, it seems more like um like a dialogue device rather than a doctrine.
yeah. And Nate, I have this is really cool. This like edition it has instead of it actually has like the pictures when he's talking about geometry and
Oh
stuff,
wow.
knowledge stuff. They're like I like pictures. But yeah, it talks about in Meno there is talk about the innate knowledge thing, and you think he brought that to
Yeah,
attention.
him and Lily get into that one.
Yeah, do you think Plato? I don't know. I don't know if I can pinpoint his view on if like on reincarnation or what that looks like. Because he hints at it with the
Um,
myth of air. Is he agreeing with the myth of air? Or is he just using it? And also, would the
Um,
afterlife be in this same world, right? Or would it be in another dimension type thing? I think it would
I
be
think
in.
I think it's helpful to look at the Timaeus when it comes to the myth of Ur. In the Timaeus, he's talking about emanation. Um, so how does he's trying to develop a cosmology, tying Athens to a greater cosmological order. Um, and there he starts to talk about prime matter and the forms, how there's a demiurge that enforces the forms onto reality, or matter, and and then this sort of divine essence trickles down into existence, and sort of the human soul
I've been
is sort
summoned.
of is sort of the last that remains. It has a little divine spark in it, and every single time it dies, it sort of returns to the stars, to the cosmos in a way.
So, Chris, what was your question? And then you brought up the Timaeus, right, to solve it. What was the question?
Oh yeah, I wonder if how literal he might think this like reincarnation of the soul might work. If it's like in the same world as it's hinted in the myth of Ur, or if it's more of like a
And then
ethereal.
Ego, you brought the Timaeus, right? So,
Right.
okay. Just that
Uh,
Ori's here, so Ori knows.
so a common reading of the myth of Ur is like it's a Hail Mary. Like if all else fails, right? You just believe in reincarnation, right? That's enough for you to buy into this definition of justice. But I say that considering the Timaeus, that it's an idea that at least is consistent with much of other Plato's thought. It's not just a one-time thing, a one-time occurrence.
So not necessarily. You're taking this out of context right there a little bit. It is consistent with other Plato's thought. That's absolutely true. But you have to realize that the Timaeus is a dialogue on cosmology, supposed to be the other half of what's going on, whereas the other late period texts, except for the Philebus, are really on metaphysics. Cosmology and metaphysics. But in the first half of the late period, in which he's revising his middle period views, he doesn't say anything about cosmology because he thinks that you need to take care of what's known as being before you take care of the idea of becoming. So it seems when we're reading the Republic, you're kind of combining Parmenides and Heraclitus. But when you're reading the late period, you're not so much combining Heraclitus, but instead you're combining Anaximander and the indefinite. So it's a little bit different than how you're making it out to be. But the Timaeus, I wouldn't necessarily say that Plato is 100% because a lot of people concerning the myth of Ur believe that that it's a lot more so this sort of appendix, and they don't even know whether or not Plato actually wanted to put the myth of Ur at Book 10 of the Republic. Book 10 alone already seems very out of place, right? Book 10 seems like it would go a lot more in around Book 4, Book 3, even Book 2, and some people even make the argument around Book 6, considering it's an explanation of the forms. So both parts, the first half and the second half of Book 10, seem to be very off topic, coming from tyranny and government to the idea of the forms, metaphysics, and even cosmology.
Well, I don't think it's too out of place because in book 9, at the end, he talks about how justice is what makes the soul harmonious, or like what can bring harmony to the soul. So it seems like a natural thing to talk about the soul next, no?
But he doesn't talk about the soul directly next. He talks about the idea of imitation first.
Where he talks about the immortality of the soul, right?
No, first he's talking about imitation. That's the first half of Book 10, right? With the form of right, the form of chair, and his views of imitation and art comes before the myth of Ur.
Yeah, I guess the first that part doesn't make too much sense, but the rest of it, the immortality of the soul and then the myth of Ur, that seems like a natural progression to me, at least when I was reading it. It seemed fair.
So I've always wondered or whether or not that end of Book 10 is actually just this sort of restatement of what he argued. Some people would say for, some people would say against in the Phaedo, and that immortality of the soul. Considering that the Phaedo was written just a bit before the Republic, as scholars usually like to think, and it seems also that you're. Hold on, let me get my Republic book out. Book 10, in my opinion, it's one of my favorite books in the Republic. Where is it? So for me, I read it a lot more so as imitative, right? The very beginning of book 10 doesn't really follow from book 9. It talks about imitative and parts of the soul. And then out of nowhere, we just get this massive myth that takes up a lot, that makes very, very little. In my opinion, I don't think it deserves its place as like the grand finale of the Republic, right?
Yeah.
Some people have made the argument that Book 10 was an addendum, like an appendix
Mhm.
to the Republic, in
Yeah.
the same way that Book 1 was a prequel. Now, I think I can definitely understand the argument for Book 10 more than Book 1, but it's more so of a stylistic thing that people argue against there.
I mean, at the end,
Now,
like it was his writing. It's like he can put wherever he wants it. Like we can like it or not,
there's
but
definitely a style to it, though. He doesn't just out of randomness kind of choose what he's talking about, right? In the sophist,
yeah.
yeah. He's not just in the sophist when he's talking about being going to out of nowhere give a cosmology, because he quite literally states that, okay, but this is an important issue, but we're not going to talk about this yet. This isn't something that we should talk about yet because we need to finish up explaining what we're explaining currently. He's not just going to stop on one issue until he's done with that issue. I think that this idea of appearance and imitation is more so to explain the idea of a not only the tripartite soul, but also the forms, because he wants your reason part of your soul to be similar to the forms. He wants the spirited side to be, hopefully following from the forms. And he admits that the appetitive side has no idea what it's talking about. So it's like the poets who create copies of copies.
Mhm.
And I really like that line that he says that it's a copy of a copy. And this sort of poet, he says, and painter, neither have knowledge nor right opinion. And that's kind of similar to the appetitive side of the soul. But the myth of I have always, I wouldn't say that I ignore it, but it's always out of nowhere to me when I read to it, when I get to it.
Or he's having internet issues again.
I'm trying to come up for a good reason he could have had to include the myth of
In the myth of I'm not sure if this is, if I'm remembering correctly, but it's a soul has to go through the underworld and they have to choose a lot that sort of determines their path of life. Or is that a similar story? Am I remembering correctly?
Could you repeat that? I had to cut out for a second.
Somebody, a soul, chooses a lot, which determines their new path of life.
That's what. Yeah, I think that's what it was. The myth.
Right.
Yeah. First they're judged and then they get to choose. Something like that.
Right. Yeah. And there's also the idea in book 10 of the three sort of craftsmen, or three makers. There's a natural maker, which makes the original concept. Then there's the actual maker, which physically makes an object, and then there's the imitator. Right. So then there's the original, there's the copy and then the copy of the copy. I wonder if that has anything to do with choosing a lot. You're sort of imitating or following an already existing idea.
I think it's more so when it comes to the imitation. I think it points out that the painters are committing a transgression by attempting to present something in a way that it's not, right? Because the craftsman is imitating the form of chair, but when the painter paints a chair, he's imitating an imitation of chair, right? So he's twice removed from the truth. It's like playing a game of telephone, right? The farther you go, the worse it gets. And so to that, he's kind of calling that. It really seems that painting shouldn't really be in our republic, and art in general, because there's no knowledge within it. And to make things popular that consist of little knowledge or no knowledge, actually, is problematic here in a perfect society, an ideal society. You want everything to be looking towards the truth, specifically the form of the good.
Ori, do you know much of? Because I remember reading or hearing one time that the king of Syracuse kind of like hired Plato to try and come up with this ideal city. It didn't work out, and I've heard because it was like some reasons of issues with like educating the youth, and then there was like some democracy kind of took over again. Do you know much about that when he tried to create this ideal city in Syracuse?
No, I don't actually. I've recently been trying to read up a little bit more on Plato's unwritten doctrines. But I'd assume like there are some readings of the Republic actually not truly being Plato's view of an ideal city, but more so Glaucon's view of an ideal city. Considering that Glaucon was historically one of the 30 tyrants, and he would have had a skewed idea of justice. He would have had a skewed idea of what truth is, and it would have looked really, really nice to him for the guardians, someone that he might be able to be the rulers of a society. Now, I think that reading sometimes somewhat ignores what's it called? It sometimes ignores the fact that there's such a heavy part of metaphysics from book 5 to 7 and book 10, which is almost half of the Republic. But the very first half of the Republic does really sound like something Glaucon would be really interested in. And so it's somewhat viable to consider that it wasn't actually Plato's view of an ideal society, but somebody else's view of an ideal society that Plato was attempting to put forward, right?
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes we try to articulate other people's opinions so we could grasp them a little bit better, right?
I think we should also probably go back to book 8 and 9. We've kind of skipped ahead a little bit.
I completely agree.
Because I understand since I've read the book, but it is a bit jarring to skip all the way to 10. I mean, we had a question about in book 8, right, Chris, about the structure of like the 4 forms of government.
5, like, yeah.
Or 5, sorry.
If you want to count the ideal one as one. But yeah, you have like the ideal one rung down the democracy, and one rung down the oligarchy, one rung down the democracy, then egg is the tyranny, or the tyrant. Like I understand how he explained the progression of them, how one turns into the other. That makes sense. But again, before you were here, Ori, I was talking about how I think I would prefer a democracy to an oligarchy, right? I don't know if I would really like the oligarchy the way it's described.
Right, structure it differently.
Democracy, but Plato decides to put that one rung above.
Well, putting it above isn't necessarily saying it's better, right? It's just kind of what it evolves from.
No, I think he does talk about better or worse. Like clearly.
Yeah.
Like,
well, no, I'm saying, but the reason that he puts it at 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, is more so linking of the process that it goes to, right? At least that's what I thought you were saying.
Yeah, no, it part of it is that's the process, like that's the evolution or the genealogy of a type of society. But he also does say, like, correct me if I'm wrong, but he does say some are like this one is better, and then Cloaken will say, yes, clearly that is the case. So that
No,
they
no, no,
have
absolutely.
claims, yeah.
So what like for a general reading, I don't know how much I agree with this, but the fall of the aristocratic government to a democratic government, which is the very first stage, I think also links it to falling from reason to falling to honor. It's from going to from the reason side of the soul to the spirited side of the soul. And it's over time, I guess, as Plato put it, it's like over time conflicts and deviation from actual philosophical values lead to a rise of a democratic society, right? And therefore, the honor and military prowess will dominate, right? So the auxiliary group will be the ones in charge. And it's a semi-compromise, I'd say, between reason and spirited ambition. But you can definitely see in the democracy, there's a lot more of a warrior class domination than a philosopher king domination, right? And I do agree that each of them are linked to a part or a function of the human soul. Like the aristocratic soul is governed by reason, right? The democratic one is governed by honor. The oligarchic one would be governed by desires that are necessary. And then the democratic one is governed by unnecessary desires. And then the tyrannical soul and tyranny, that's going to be just enslaved to your vices, enslaved to unlawful desires. And he kind of warns us that the corruption of a state's value, it begins in a very, very subtle way. And it misaligns priorities like wealth, honor, and freedom. And I think that the decline into tyranny is also this sort of caution against the dangers of our desires, right? And why we need philosophical governance, right? Now, I do agree it does have a little bit of a pessimistic views of political cycles, but I don't think that's the key point. I think that's a possible takeaway. I think that it's more so to highlight the necessity of philosophical wisdom to maintain justice. So,
You know what book A reminds me a lot of? The genealogy of morals. A little evolution. He was like Plato's first. This guy came in late to the party.
yeah, he hated Plato.
He hated everyone. What a dick.
I mean, he fucked with Socrates, but not Plato.
No, but yeah, the evolution makes sense, but I don't know about the rank ordering. I don't know if that makes too much sense to me, intuitively at least, like at face value.
I think it does. More so because the oligarchy, which was I think your problem was that you think democracy was better than oligarchy, right? And not vice versa.
Yeah, or like maybe not the idea of it, but the outcomes of it, right? So like where in democracy the outcomes are like individual freedoms and stuff. The oligarchy is a divide between rich and poor. Like I'd rather take a bunch of people kind of on like looking at and preferring freedom than one preferring and looking at wealth or material possessions, etc. I don't know. I think I have a preference there for democracy. I don't love democracy, but I think I'd put it above the oligarchy.
I see why you say that. No, absolutely. But I think Plato's big point of putting democracy second to tyranny is more so that democracy sets the stage for chaos. It leads to this sort of lack of moral discipline. So the entire city no longer has the same moral code. And that's already a pretty bad thing. So because of that, that's already like a very, very, very big negative, right? And that big negative is to
Output.
Plato a little bit worse than being an oligarchic state.
No, yeah, I think I'm coming to agree with that a little bit. It's its proximity to tyranny that makes it worse, not like maybe the outcomes of it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, no. Necessary. I think that's absolutely true, especially, when you're in a democracy, freedom is kind of devolving into this sort of license to power, right? And this tyrant who's charismatic seizes power by exploiting fears and desires. We quite literally see that happen, like in Nazi Germany. That's exactly what Hitler did, right? He seized power by exploiting fear of a specific kind of people, and he said, "I'll promise to restore order." And then what did he do? He killed everybody who was against him. And so there's this modern parallel that totalitarian regimes are born from democratic instability. Mussolini is another example. And I think there's a modern parallel to all five of these, right?
Is totalitarianism, what a mouthful, is that analogous to a tyranny?
I think
Or
that
this-
he would say, I think that we need to take Plato as a little bit different, because this was 2,500 years ago. So totalitarian regimes definitely are tyranny. I think Hitler was a tyrant. Mussolini was a tyrant. In the terms set forth. And I believe that in theory, some constitutional monarchies and technocratic systems almost aspire to be an aristocrat government because they emphasize, now I don't know, now this isn't necessarily true, but they emphasize that the government should be governed by the most knowledgeable and morally sound individuals, right? So it sounds like a perfect judiciary in a democracy, right? With their focus on impartiality, rational decision making, and that kind of reflects that ideal. But obviously, that isn't necessarily true. Some people like to think of the structure of ancient Athenian democracy, and its prime as a really nice aristocracy, because it focused on philosophical discussion, not destruction, philosophical discussion, under Pericles, and I think that democracy, the reason that is what comes next is because it still values discipline. And that's a very big part for Plato, right? We want to have a disciplined soul. So the democracy still values discipline, but loses reason as its guiding role, right? Now, I don't necessarily think that a military dictatorship or a military system led by the strongest is good, but honor, strength, and discipline is still dominating there, right? Now, I think any nationalist regime that prioritized military power over economic progress would fall under this category. So something maybe like post-colonial African governments where I think it was Nigeria in the past was under military rule for a long time. And you could also see why Plato thought this, because the only thing that was second to Athens was Sparta, which was military class held power.
Thing, yeah, he liked what they had going for them versus thing. He advocates
No,
for it,
absolutely. And
but early in the book.
right after our democracy, right, we have our oligarchy. And this is where we're getting pretty iffy here, right? Wealth becomes this dominant value, but he kind of sees it as this necessary desire rather than an unnecessary desire. And that's the problem with democracy that I'll get to here in a second. But power is concentrated really among the rich people. It creates a sharp divide between the wealthy elite, and the mass of impoverished people. And this isn't necessarily something that Plato's in for, right? He doesn't like this, but he's definitely going to put it above. He's definitely going to put it above the democracy, because the democracy is dominated by unnecessary desires, right? We want so much. Not we as in us right now, but like we as in Plato and the democracy, that they want so much unnecessary things, like and vote on things that really have nothing to do with making the state better. Sometimes you see parallels like that today, but think that of lobbying in democracies, right, where corporations and the wealthy elite, right, they have a disproportionate amount of influence on policy making, right? And that kind of reflects the oligarchic dynamics. So, in a sense, you could somehow view some kind of some areas in the United States as an oligarchy, but we kind of just claim to be a democracy, right? But then we kind of realize that democracy emerges because of that, because we want everybody to be free, right? We want everybody to have equal power, and we're angry at the people who are rich who have all the power. And that quickly leads into a lack of structure, a lack of discipline. And everybody wants to be this individualized person that has as much power as the next. And that leads to a lot of disorder. Now, without sufficient safeguards, we face challenges like populism, right? Polarization, instability. So it seems like this social media-driven public discourse truly embodies Plato's warning about democracy's vulnerabilities. Think of pre-World War II Germany. It collapsed into tyranny because of unchecked populism. And think of modern democracies today, whose populist leaders undermine institutions, such as the United States under some of our previous presidents. Give me a second. I gotta open the door.
You're good. Does anyone want to chime in on thoughts? Kate?
I'm just absorbing it, man.
Happy to be here.
I'm absorbing it like a sponge.
Yeah. Like, in every democracy, there's whispers of oligarchy, and then in every tyranny, there's whispers of this like excessive liberal freedom. So it's
Right.
coherent. It makes sense to me, at least. Yeah. Anyways, continue with what you were saying, Ori.
Sorry. I've done so much research on this. Sorry if I'm like taking it up. So I think it's also easy to understand how tyranny is like comes from democracy, and some people today might make the argument like we're in the United States quite literally about to go into a tyranny. It's arises from the excess of somebody want to be powerful. That was kind of the point of the democracy, that everybody wants their own individual power. And when that happens, somebody is born who can see the issues with that and takes advantage of that. So the tyrant, he exploits the populace's fears, right? He centralizes the power and suppresses this sort of dissent of the people. And then he prioritizes his own personal gain over the common good. But he does it in such a way that we'll see in Book 9 that the people don't necessarily see it for a little bit, right? Because they're so angry at the oligarchy that the tyrant kind of is born from this democracy, right? So we see authoritarian and totalitarian regimes reflecting these, right? Leaders are rising by exploiting democratic weaknesses, and this sort of societal chaos by promising stability by slowly eroding the freedoms of the people. Hitler, I can't say this enough, right? He rose to power from a democratic process before establishing this totalitarian regime. Think North Korea, right? North Korea, Kim Jong-un, somewhat similar. At least not how he rose to power, but how he's handling himself, right? It's he promises stability, but he's slowly taking away everyone else's freedom. So I think the cycle of regime that Plato talks about does give us some insights in the modern context, right? The Great Depression of the 20s, right? It saw democracies weaken and gave rise to fascism in parts of Europe. And I think in today's political landscape, right, there's a growing economic inequality, and it raises concerns about potential shifts from democracy to more authoritarian structures. So just like Plato warned, right, inequality is the catalyst. These extreme disparities destabilize regimes, right? Whether it be economic, which would be oligarchical, social, which would be democratic, or political, which would be democratic. And so Plato has a pessimistic model for sure on something like free press.
Why would a democracy be social if it's concerned with individual honor?
Because it's a specific social class that rules above the rest, right? It's the specific army. The army would be a social class there for Plato.
But the rest, like that's how they rule. But like did you mean social just within this ruling class, just within the auxiliaries, or social as in like the general population?
Social disparity. Social disparity. So obviously we can understand that Plato's pretty pessimistic from free press, checks and balances. Or he's a little bit pro checks and balances, I should say. But he thinks that our education system for sure would be the main thing that prevents degeneration. But the second we're away from an aristocracy, our education system goes to shit, as Plato would say, right? Like Plato's critique of these unchecked liberties leading to tyranny, I think, does echo current debates on the balance between individual rights and societal order. I mean, that's really my spiel. So if we want to talk about it, I think that's it that I have for book A.
I was thinking, I mean, Chris earlier had a question before Ori came in about how democracy resulted in actions different from a tyranny, right? That was a question you had. And hearing Ori speak, that reminded me of Plutarch's account of Publicula or Publius in the Roman Republic, where he promised, or his attitude he presented to the people was, "Oh, you guys have the power, right? You guys have the-" But really, the way that Plutarch explains it is that in itself was him exerting his force over the people. The promise of power for the people was a way that he could influence them or gain their trust or gain their allow them to hand over their political power to him, which is similar to Theseus's rule, or at least he's a mythical character. It's not really sure if he actually existed or not. But at least in his life, it seems that he also gained like the favor of the people, but not through promises, but through through honorful acts. So there seems to be a continuum there between a democracy and a timocracy, in the sense that in a democracy it seems to be possible to gain the people's approval, but again it's not the same at all. But there is characteristics of all in all forms of regimes. And so I guess the distinction between a tyranny and a democracy would be if you had in a democracy, we had tyrannical representatives. It'd just be the way that they present themselves would be different.
Yeah. Gotcha.
I think that's definitely true. I think a lot of times people aren't going to be like, yeah, I'm a tyrant, right? People are, I always found that the only reason Book 8 and Book 9 aren't separate from each other, or are separate from each other, is because it's just too long of a read. All the other ones are about 25 to 35 pages. But I feel like Book 9 is quite literally just a continuation of Book 8. And so, he kind of points out that the tyrant, he has to make sure that everybody else stays happy, so they don't know that he's necessarily a tyrant, right? So if we're living under tyranny right now, the tyrant would be doing a good job if we didn't know that he was a tyrant. And I think that he also, if I remember correctly, argues that the tyrant's actually the saddest person of everyone, right? He's actually the
I wouldn't say maybe
How do I say this?
the most internally conflicted. Yeah.
Right. So, because he's a slave to his desires, right? And he's no longer. He appears to have absolute freedom, but he's not free in any sense, because true freedom for Plato comes from this sort of alignment with reason and self-discipline. So while they appear powerful, they're internally very weak and dependent on the compliance of others. And here it seems like Plato's reaffirming that the life of justice is inherently more fulfilling than the one of injustice. And this is a big theme in early Platonic dialogue and middle Platonic dialogues, right? I think it definitely resonates with modern authoritarian rulers who often live in paranoia and isolation, even though they're like super powerful, right? We have pictures of where Kim Jong-un lives and then where everyone else lives, right? He's very scared of somebody coming and killing him.
Yeah, we were talking about that before you got here. It's like, it's for the same reason there's bulletproof glass in every car or every vehicle that a person in power drives around, for the same reason they're wrapped around with bodyguards.
Yeah, it's this idea that the superiority of justice over injustice, it provides this sort of, how do I say this? Like this sort of foundation for an ethical governance and leadership. If your government and your leader was an ethical one, nobody would be anti them, right? So it seems that the tyrannical soul, the tyrant, right? Rational thought is completely overpowered by this sort of immediate gratification, and long-term goals and ethical pleasures, ethical principles are discarded, in favor of fleeting pleasures. And to me, I've always had this idea to write a paper on the psychology of the tyrant being very similar to the psychology of an addict. Their desires really take over them, right? They don't care who they hurt. And I think that Plato does have a smaller example of addiction, greed and lust, right? So it seems that the addict or the tyrant, once their rational and spirited parts are subdued, the individual, the tyrant, really becomes unable to resist their temptations. The soul, it becomes this fragmented thing has conflicting desires, and it leads to internal discord, right? They're a tyrant over their own life. They're ruled by vices rather than reason at that point. And they become self-alienated. They don't know who they are anymore, and they don't know their own purpose. And that to me sounds a lot like somebody struggling with addiction.
Right, Plato uses the language of drones, right? Of sort of like an image of a mindless person, kind of like a zombie, just droning about.
Right. You definitely do have to keep an eye out, though, when you say Plato uses the language, considering that we're reading translations.
Translation, right, yeah.
Yeah. But I do think that it is, this paradoxical loss of freedom through this pursuit of unbridled freedom, through this indulgence. You're actually enslaving yourself, right? You're becoming a slave to your own desires, and you're no longer able to make rational choices, something that you would think that the free man is able to do. So there's a small theme that's almost never picked up on when reading Platonic dialogue, something that I don't think he ever lets go. But he says that the only person who is truly free is the philosopher. The only person who is truly free is the one who knows the power of rational capacity. And sometimes an entire dialogue, he'll only say about a line for it, right? But he takes it as a given. And so that when Plato takes something as a given, that means it's truly, truly something that he really believes, because he takes nothing as a given usually in these dialogues. He always has the need to explain something. So this vice-driven person who often isolates them from others, they're consumed by not only selfishness but also distrust, right? Their relationships suffer because their interactions, they're governed by manipulation and exploitation rather than the genuine connection, right? Hitler couldn't trust anyone, even the closest people to him. He couldn't trust the people he wanted to bring into his bedroom. He really just,
Funny enough, he also had his drug problems.
yeah. And this kind of erodes into all your moral virtues, right? You're no longer honest, you're no longer compassionate, you're no longer courageous. And that's kind of what a virtuous person is when it comes to Plato, right? Compassion, honesty, courage, wisdom, moderation, those are all virtues for Plato. So when you lose your connection to these higher ideals, you're not only descending into a purely materialistic existence, but we see this, like, you're getting so far away from the forms.
Yeah, I was watching a couple lectures, and I like the way they explained. Because I think last talk we were talking about how we can be sure we have a grasp of the forms and not just something approximate or similar to the forms. And he was explaining it as like an asymptotic relationship, right? Something like we can never 100% grasp the forms, but we can get really damn close to grasping the forms. And I like that.
Yeah, absolutely.
An asymptotic relationship between the philosopher and these forms or these ideals.
No, and I think that's definitely something that many people do hold too, because at the end of the day, we always are going to have our body holding us down. It seems very, very impossible. And if not impossible, very, very difficult to reach the forms. Like, no matter what square, we were talking about this yesterday, or not yesterday, last time. No matter what circle, no matter what square, it's never going to be a perfect square, a perfect circle. But we can get really, really, really close to it, right?
We're really, really close to understanding what the perfect circle is, was the point, I think, it wasn't of drawing up a square, but it was of understanding a square.
Right. No, it's just a metaphor.
Okay, gotcha.
And I also do think that I really like Plato's prescription to overcome your vices. That the idea that, you need to strengthen your rationality through knowledge and self-reflection. And philosophy provides those tools. You have to practice moderation to curb these appetites and align your daily actions with long-term goals and values. And I think that's really important. I think that we see that today in successful people, or at the very least happy people, who their daily actions aren't just actions of, I guess, appetitive pleasures, but actions that genuinely make them happy in the long run. That's something that just can't get grabbed away from them instantaneously. I really like Plato's psychology here, because he says that you got to surround yourself with virtuous individuals and supportive structures that encourage rational and moral behavior. And everybody always calls Plato and Aristotle opposites, but even Aristotle takes this up. Now, by prioritizing this sort of collective well-being over your personal gain, you're able to transcend selfish desires and achieve this kind of harmonic soul. And I really like the way back up that he provides rather than kind of saying, well, that sucks for the tyrant.
I wanted to talk about the soul a bit more, and I think I mentioned it maybe in like one of the past meetings, but it was this idea of it's like on the metaphysics, on the metaphysical side of things. So like beyond this world, it's the are there a finite? Well, question one is: are there a finite amount of souls out there? Right? Is there a certain number of it? Certain number of souls out there? And then question two is: how are souls? Souls are eternal, right? So, are there a finite amount of souls? They are eternal, but then also, he kind of suggests with the myth of Ur that maybe they can come back into being. At what rate do they come back into being, and in what forms? If it's into this world, let's like posit that maybe these souls are being reincarnated or like given bodies back into this world. Just like posit that. Wouldn't there be some sort of like infinite backlog, right? Like imagine there's a period of time
I see what you're saying.
where
And this is definitely something that's in contention in scholarship. People are like, a lot of people just kind of boil it down to, oh, it's a myth, right? And I've always thought that's like running away from the problem, because it does seem weird, right? It's odd that it's odd that the soul is immortal. But theoretically, like one could take that to even mean that there's only one soul in all of existence, right? That just relives every other life. And that seems weird because that means, you would put that in terms like the same soul is both Hitler and the millions who died. And I didn't have, I always, that's the reason that I don't necessarily like that last part of book 10. I think it's interesting, but I genuinely like the critique of art and poetry a lot more.
I really like the part of the soul because like I'm just trying to like imagine. I said like, cool, I die, then my soul, what? It just goes into like this heavenly waiting room,
Right, like a limbo kind of
like,
thing.
I'm just sitting in a corner waiting for another like a body to pop up, waiting for two people to bang so I can inhabit a body.
Right.
No one's having. Am I just in that waiting room forever? Or if there's too many babies and there's not enough souls to inhabit the bodies, right? Are there an infinite amount of souls in this waiting room, ready to go to hop into these bodies that come into existence? Or if there's a finite number of souls, if there's only a certain amount of souls, then we need to take care of how many people are being born at a given time, right? Or like,
well, so I also think that you have to remember that the phase of judgment in the myth lasts for 1,000 years. I think that's the number that he used.
But what's interesting is it's still temporal, right? It's not atemporal,
right,
which makes it super tricky, regardless of how long you put it in terms of time.
And I think that, after completing their time of reward or punishment, you're kind of gathered, right, in this sort of meadow or some sort, to prepare for your reincarnation, and you get to select from options that you deserve, right? And you can be a human, an animal, you can be rich, poor, virtuous, tyrannical. And I can just imagine the soul who waited for 1,000 years be like, damn, I have to choose the tyrannical man who hates himself. Like, and
wait, so
you end up,
in the myth, you can choose to inhabit a non-human?
yes.
So does that mean Plato thinks that everything has a soul? I thought it was.
Yes.
I thought it was only humans could have these souls with reasonable capacities, or like with this tripartite division.
Right, now remember, the soul has a rational capacity, but because of your body, the soul doesn't even know sometimes that it's rational, right? So the body of a tree wouldn't even be able to make judgments. Therefore, it seems to negate that it's rational at all.
but it still has. If in souls it's baked in that they have rationality or capacity to reason.
Well, I don't think he ever actually denies that animals have rational capacity. I just think that he definitely denies that it's as strong as a human's.
I feel like he does deny rationality. I forget where, but he denies the rationality. He says that somewhere. I forget where in one of his writings, but that animals they don't have this rational capacity.
I don't necessarily think so, because even when you're examining, so okay, you're gonna need some background here. In the Philebus, he examines a life of both a purely rational thing, that has no take in any pleasure, and a purely pleasureful thing that has no take in any intellectual capacity, right? And both of them he basically compares to a life of a mollusk.
Yeah.
No matter what, you're going, if you don't have both, it seems like you don't, it's not a life that you want to live. So real, Chiro. So real.
What did he say? What did he say?
Incredible, Jiro.
Here, look, I just asked the ChatGPT scholar whatever if animals have souls according to Plato, and then it spit this out. His views on whether animals have souls are derived from his broader metaphysical framework, whatever. His understanding of the soul as the animating principle of life and the vehicle for intellectual and moral activity. While Plato does not address the question of animals' souls extensively in his works, the implication of his philosophy, Plato's views on animal souls, he would affirm animals possess souls because they are alive and capable of movement, perception, and desire.
Right, no, that makes sense.
All of which he attributes to the soul's activity. In the Timaeus, he suggests that animals were created as part of the cosmic order, that their souls being derived from the same source as human souls, but with different capacities. So there's a categorical difference, it seems like, between a human soul
Right, no,
and an animal soul.
Which makes sense because I think it was, I think it's the Phaedo, if I'm not mistaken, and I think the Timaeus too, that the only reason things are living is because there's a soul within that body specifically. Things would not be living and able to develop had they not having any soul, right? So that makes more sense. Yeah, I forgot about that part in the Phaedo.
So like it
I
seems
will say,
in this waiting room once you die, in this waiting room when you're given a couple options of which bodies to inhabit, I think it's wrong to say that you can choose the body of an animal since there's a categorical difference between your soul and the souls of animals. Because animals, here's it saying, they don't possess reason like we do, or the souls of animals do not possess reason like ours do. So it seems like you can't.
but your soul is still there, though. There's still a soul there.
There's still a soul there, yes, but you can't. Like our souls cannot be an animal soul in the next life, or else it would be a different soul.
I think it's up to debate, really. And I haven't read too much about this part of Plato, I'm gonna be honest. But I think there could be an argument made that if you led a life filled with very, very, very little rational thought as a human, it would make sense for you to go into the soul of an animal because you didn't use any reason, and you therefore seem to be one who should go into an animal soul because you don't have a reason as a human. Like, what hope is there for you, you know?
But using very little reason is still using reason. There's no person who has absolutely zero zero capacity to reason. Otherwise, they wouldn't have a soul the way a normal human has. They wouldn't have a human soul.
I think human constitutes the body, soul constitutes the suke. And so when we say human soul, we would just mean a soul in a human's body. You can still have an animal soul. That would be a soul in an animal's body.
But it needs that vessel in this world. They're like
right. What do you mean? Like I'm trying to.
Like I don't think an animal soul can can't inhabit a human body, and a human soul, or like our souls, cannot inhabit an animal's body. Here it's saying in the Phrygius and the Timaeus, it's talking about the transgression of souls, of them being reincarnated.
What was that first one?
In the Phaedrus and the Timaeus,
Yeah.
it talks about transgression of souls and the reincarnation based on moral and intellectual qualities, right? So if a soul does not possess those qualities, it cannot go into the same type of body. Oh
So
no,
if
but
you possess very little intellectual qualities, I don't see the problem in going into an animal soul
yeah, no, here
or
it's
going
like
into an animal body.
souls that fail to live just and philosophical lives may be reincarnated into animal bodies as a form of cosmic justice. There's a continuity, maybe there's a continuity between the soul of humans and animals, albeit in different forms. So that's a little funky because the way I understand a soul is that it's eternal and it's eternal, but I guess it still changes. It can change. It can lose and gain properties if this is the case.
I don't necessarily. I think it's losing and gaining physical properties, and that's obvious because it's physic. What is physical is always becoming, right? The soul is always going to be the soul.
Yeah. But a soul can have it, or here it's saying a soul can have either reason or not have reason, or have intellectual capacities once instantiated in a vessel, or not have them. Those seem like properties of the soul to me.
The only true property of the soul for Plato, well, no, actually, hold on. No, so there's two separate things that we need to know for Plato. There's there's a cause and a necessary condition, right? It's a aitia and a sunaitia. And what that means is that the cause is something that basically made something happen. The necessary condition is something that had to be there for the cause to be able to do what it does. So for example, a very crude example, we can say salt water, right? You need salt to make salt water. It was the salt that created the salt water, but the water had to be there for there. Like that's a necessary condition is water. But the cause had to be salt.
In the same way that the demiurge needed the forms to exist in order to impose them.
Actually, the demiurge created the forms, which is very weird. It's a very different kind of forms. It's a different kind of forms. It's a late period forms, which are very different than our forms in the middle period.
It doesn't describe it that way. It's described as the demiurge existing with the forms. Yeah, at least in the Timaeus.
But you have to remember the Timaeus about becoming and not being, and that's why we can't.
Well, it's like right after the Republic. Like it's usually thought to be like a continuation.
No, the Timaeus was one of the very last things Plato ever wrote.
So was the Republic was one of Plato's later works as well.
No, the Republic was in the very, very middle of the middle period.
That's okay. I would okay.
I mean, there's extensive literature on this.
Yeah, I know.
And it's generally agreed that the Republic was the middle of the middle period.
I'm looking at I'm relying on Christopher Rowe, his interpretation.
Yeah, I can give you a few articles. You can also look at David Bostock. You can look at Terry Penner. And he both takes into account the stylistic attributes of it too, because the Timaeus uses this sort of method of collection division, and that's something that the Republic doesn't even know what it is, right? The Republic uses hypothesis and the elenkos. And so just the stylistic differences are very explicit. I think that it sounds very similar, but dramatically, yes, the Timaeus does come after the Republic, insofar as, there's a reference to the conversation in the Republic in the Timaeus. But the dramatic difference, like the dramatic order of the dialogues, is not the same thing as the early Middle Late period. If that's the case, then the Parmenides, one of Plato's hardest works, would be the very first dialogue Plato wrote, and that just doesn't make sense to say.
Mhm.
So, I guess now that let's wrap up this Republic. Closing remarks, and then we can talk about what to read next if you guys have any suggestions. Ori, I know you sent me a message about things you maybe wanted to read for the next book club, so you can like say them again. Or anyone else here, if you have something you'd want to read, suggest it. But closing remarks for the Republic. It was about justice. It was about states. It was about the soul. It was about forms, and so on. Did you guys like it? Obviously, I know Ori's gonna like it, but Caden, Chiro, and just all you guys, did you enjoy the reading? Because I know I have some friends that just didn't like reading it at all. They don't like the dialogue format or like the way it was written.
I mean, as the books went on, it got a lot better. I think once around book 5 started, I started to get really hooked in.
Mhm.
Like, I don't know. Like at first, I was just kind of like, okay, they're arguing about justice, whatever. Like, I don't know. And then I don't know. I just got hooked in later. So yeah, I enjoyed it a lot.
Oh, you Ego.
I don't enjoy the Republic as much as I enjoy the later works.
Yeah. Well, do you have a favorite?
The Sophist,
Sophist?
the nature of falsehood.
Insofar as the Republic is one of the first philosophical works I read, it has like a nostalgic value for me. So, in that respect, it's enjoyable. It was enjoyable when I first read it. Like, wow, it wasn't just a dialogue or another philosophical work for me. It was also the doorway into philosophy for me. So it has that place in my life. So it would always be enjoyable.
It started off having that nostalgic factor for me, but I'm not gonna lie, I got a bit bored with it because it was just like like stuff I've already written papers about, stuff I've already like I don't know. I just wanted to kind of move on, do something else for a lot of this book club. I love Plato. I like it, but like I spent like too much of my undergrad reading up on it and like studying it. And now I'm just like, okay, let's do the next thing now.
Yeah, no, I kind of agree with that. I really don't care for the first half of the Republic. It to me feels like a restatement of and like a summary of everything else that he's said in his other works. The middle half I usually use just to kind of see the middle half. The middle part of the Republic, I kind of usually just use to see his evolution of metaphysics because that's kind of what I like in Plato. And so I usually am into more so the metaphysics and the method that Plato uses. And I think a lot of that comes from books 5 to 7 and then book 10, first half at least.
Yeah, I'm totally on board. I don't like this might piss some people off, but I don't like political books or books about politics or books about
I agree.
things.
Yeah.
Completely interested I like the psychology, the internal psychology, not the social psychology.
Yeah.
That stuff. I like the internal psychology. I like the metaphysics, and I like the ontology of this book. Everything else, I don't care much for. Like the way a state is structured, I don't care that much. The way the soul is structured, that's cool. That's cool potatoes for me. But
I mean, I do enjoy how he tied it in with the metaphysics. Like he didn't just build the state just to build one, right?
Yeah.
I do like the way that he presented it quite a lot.
Well, do you enjoy the political insofar as it was sort of a window into the soul? It seemed to be said that there's a symbiotic relationship between the order of the city and the order of the soul.
yeah, it's a good analogy or a good comparison, like good way of looking at it. That's about it. Yeah. You get some, what did you say? You get some Freudian shit here with the sentiment of this. Yeah. Yeah. So next book recommendations. What do you guys want to read?
Well, I
Go ahead.
Oh, you can go ahead.
I was recommending this book that Cade has been on my ass to read called Phenomenology of Perception. And Cade, you want to break that down for us real quick?
Well, a lot of phenomenology is like really difficult, so
Oh.
it's really hard to get into. Ponty, the phenomenology of perception, is probably one of the easier phenomenology works to get into. Not saying it's easy because phenomenology in general is not easy. Like it's very complicated, but the phenomenology of perception has to do with embodied experiences, and it's very related to ideas. Well, a lot of it actually was the basis for like modern cognitive science and different things, but it's about kind of, man, it's really hard to explain, but like it's nothing you've ever read before, I would guess, because he's trying to embody philosophy more, and he has like these weird terms like the hyper dialectic and like all these different weird conceptions. A lot of his philosophy is relational rather than like static objects. A lot of it is about perception and our perceptions. And I don't know, that's kind of like a little summary of it, but
I like that because
it's hard to explain.
I like that a lot because my whole field is cognitive science or philosophy of mind and phenomenology.
Yeah, so it's very cognitive sciencey, like in a sense. It's very embodied, his philosophy. He's almost like trying to bring Heidegger back into the body, if that makes sense.
I've always wanted to get into phenomenology, but a lot of phenomenologists are overly existential. And for me, existentialism sometimes just completely ignores some very important things and overplaces importance in other areas. So I would like to definitely read something like that for sure. Another thing that I recommended to Chris was something called Love and Friendship by Alan Bloom that kind of just goes through the idea both philosophically and historically of what love and friendship are. And I always thought that could be a fun little project. It's not too long, if I remember correctly. And then there was a few more. One was Spinoza's Ethics, but that's pretty tough work, so we probably won't do that. And then the other one was something called Simulacra and Simulation, where it kind of explores this idea that society is kind of dominated by these things called simulations, right? So copies without originals, where reality is so replaced by these representations that are so convincing, and then the distinction between the real and the simulated kind of becomes blurred, right? So we have copies that are no longer referencing any underlying reality, and he has this sort of theory of hyperreality, right, where the simulated world seems to become more real than what is actual. And I always kind of thought that of like some people are a lot more close to Indiana Jones, right, than Harrison Ford. Some people are a lot more close to it's very similar to when the Ted Bundy documentary came out, and a lot of people were like, "Oh my God, he's so hot! Like, he's a serial killer." Like, so I kind of always wanted to read that, where this idea that mass media and technology really create or contribute at least to the creation of like simulations, by producing and circulating images that don't actually reflect reality.
That does kind of tie into Ponte a little bit too. I don't know if it is in the phenomenology of perception, but he does talk about like, I might be confused with someone else actually, but I do remember a talk about like presentation versus representation, right? Reality, it's kind of like the reality versus hyper reality, and people often live in this representation of things rather than as it is. So it kind of ties into that last book you recommended a bit, I think.
In a way, it reminds me of McIntyre's After Virtue. The taking of philosophical ideas outside of their context, but it's not so phenomenological as these other texts that you guys are discussing.
Yeah.
What were you guys?
I mean, I have.
Oh, sorry. Go for it.
Go ahead. Oh, okay. Well, I have the only recommendations I could really give is like if you guys want to read any Kierkegaard, because obviously I'm kind of like the Kierkegaard guy of the server. I know you did reference the sickness unto death, and you said that would be difficult. I actually do not think the sickness unto death is difficult. I think it's very easy to get through, and I feel like I could easily translate his words. Yeah.
I think it's easy to understand or get to, given a background or foundational like stuff about Kierkegaard. Like,
Yeah,
it's
I think the book is actually one of his most straightforward. It's one of his later works, so he kind of, well, yeah, you have to
aside from
abandon
the
like the
first page,
ideas of the absurd and leap
let
of
me read
faith.
you guys. Let me read you guys the first page. The human being is
Oh
spirit.
God,
What is spirit? The spirit is self. But what is self? Self is a relation which relates to itself, or that
that's
is
itself.
relation which is relating to itself. Self is not the relation, but the relation relating to. Like, you need a little bit of
Yep.
background to understand.
Well, I mean, it's
Cade, what are you
yeah,
doing?
that's part of the, like Chiro said, that's part of the ironic jab at Hegel, the way that he's wording it. But in the end, he is still trying to get across a message, which that the self is not some kind of static entity; it is a relational entity.
Yeah.
And even further in the book, he talks about like, I mean, this is part of his critique of Hegel. If you relate yourself to something that is below God, basically, he talks about, then you're going to be missing some parts of life. So if you only relate yourself as, I don't know, like a basketball player, well, what happens when you get injured? It's over, right? He critiques Hegel, saying if we only relate ourselves to this, well, Hegel within Christendom, if we only relate ourselves to the state, that's also a pretty shallow existence, right? If we relate ourselves only to the political state. So that's part of his critique of Hegel. But I mean, he goes further and says that we need to we don't negate the universal, we don't negate the ethical. What we do is we need to integrate it into our lives rather than just having it as some abstract existential spirit. But like I said, I think I could give a pretty easy rundown and easily explain these few like they're actually not as complicated as they look. I can promise you.
No. I remember it being drawn out in like a diagram in one of my courses, trying to help the class
That's just
understand that.
useless. there's very, I mean, it's pretty simple too. It's like he talks about the body, was it the body, the mind, and something else like being a synthesis.
Mhm.
And if they're out of line, you're in despair. I mean, just think about it this way. Let's say my body wants to like eat all the candy in the refrigerator, but my mind is like, dude, like that's not healthy. Then you're out of, the relations between the internal relations within you are in conflict and you fall into despair. I mean, I think it's actually pretty simple what he's saying, but he just likes to, shoot. Like, Hegel's always catching strays in his work, basically.
Yeah, he is. What would
But
you
I mean,
guys
it doesn't have to
think?
be the sickness.
Yeah, true.
It could be any of them.
What
We could
would you
do
guys
any of them. I'm
think?
just saying, if anyone wants to do Kierkegaard, just
You're the guy.
yeah.
You're a Kierkegaard guy, Ori's our Plato guy.
I think we could get through it, right? We could get through it. I think it would be pretty
Yeah.
interesting because I think a lot more people, at least in this Discord, are more concerned with. I don't mean this in a mean way, but more just like with like the human experience rather than some disembodied like republic type thing. I think that's why people got disinterested. You know, they
Hey,
want
Kate,
more of
what if
a.
I recommended The Sophist?
I would love that. I mean, I'm saying I love it. I'm just. I love the republic, right? I'm just trying to. I guess I'm catering.
How is that which is not, and how is not that which is?
Hmm? What
Sorry,
was
say
that?
again. I totally interrupted you.
Oh
No,
no,
I
I was just given a stupid line from The Sophist where he goes, "How can we show that that which is not, and that which is not is?"
It'll end up
Kate is
being a book.
catering.
It'll end up being a. I'm gonna appeal to democracy when it comes to choosing the book. I'll get like. I'll
Yeah,
get,
but we just recommend like
We
10
just
books.
learned aristocracy is the best.
Yeah,
That means
Aris- come on, get rid of it. We're about to fall into tyranny if we let Chris keep doing this. You know.
Yo, Chris, what about the idea that the people who like, do you think more people are gonna show up or different people are gonna show up on the other books? Because I'm scared that people are gonna vote and then they're not gonna show up.
the thing is that, or since I've started, almost every book attracts some different people. I started off with what was the first book we did? I think we did Nausea by Sartre. That was our first one, and that had like recurring people coming, a different group. And then we did I don't know, another one, and then we did Fear and Trembling, which had like a different group of people with Chiro and Cade was there. He helped us out a lot. And then we did The Republic. Um, forgetting other ones that we did, but each one like attracts its own crowd, right?
Okay, because I'm just this is obviously my first book with y'all, but I'm still a little bit like sketched out that there are gonna be people who vote, and some people are gonna have to read things that
Right.
the people who aren't showing up voted for, right?
Yeah, it feels like the majority of people who voted for the Republic probably did not show up. You know,
Oh yeah, that's just how it goes.
so that's
Uh,
kind of
I'm-
weird.
I'm gonna use it as a metric. I'll take.
I'm not
it
sure
into
the
account.
solution, but yeah.
I'll make like
I'm not sure the solution, but yeah.
no, like it won't be a definitive thing, right? But it will be a gauge on like what people like more or less. I'll end up making the final decision a la Tyron, right? But I will gauge and see like what people are more inclined towards.
I feel like too, maybe like again, maybe the Republic was too hard for a lot of people, a little bit too much of a gruel.
And it was long.
So I feel like maybe people maybe did want to read it, but they have no idea how to get through it reading it on their own. So perhaps if we picked a book, we could, like have at least some people explain the book in some ways or like help them through it so that more people show up and more people engage. That's just an idea. I'm not sure.
Yeah, it's also another thing is like the length of the book, right? So like if
Right.
like the Republic, we did what like 10 weeks or something like that, or not like 5 weeks or something like that. It was like 2 books a week more or less.
It's about
I don't know how
240
long the other ones took, but
It's about 240 pages.
The other ones like Nausea, we did it in three or four meetings. Fear and Trembling, I think it was. How many did we do that one in? Was it 2 or 3? It was.
I only came to the last few.
Hey, what do we
For
think
elective.
of doing journal articles? Like just for like a intermission kind of week, right? Where we read like smaller journal articles that they're not necessarily super hard, not something so into a specific subject, but something like Epiphenomenal Qualia by Frank Jackson. It's not super hard, but anybody can definitely understand it if they just took the time to read it. About 20 pages. We can discuss it one day, and that'll kind of be like this intermission week to decide what comes next.
Yeah, no, like I like that idea of like reading one paper per meeting, its own isolated thing, right? So it doesn't have to be continuous. Yeah, that's cool. What would you guys think of
Yes.
of what would you guys think of going the psychological or cognitive science route? I have a couple of cool books that you guys might hate, but this
I
one,
think they're only willing probably to do one that's related to philosophy, like the
they are
Yeah.
phenomenology of
they're heavy
perception.
philosophy. This one is, for example, free will and the science of the brain, right? So it's about sciences,
You
about
said
free will.
science. You lost me, man. You said science.
And
Trigger
then
word.
evil is another cool one. Big on, it's all about like
Science.
psychopath personality disorders, all that type of stuff. But this is maybe
I think phenomenology of perception would probably be the best way to go if we wanted to do anything close to that, because it isn't cog sci, but it was a precursor that inspired it.
You could do the structure of scientific revolution.
I have a recommendation regarding psychological philosophy. It's by Robert Solomon. He was a professor at UT Austin. He's dead now, but not too long ago. He was alive not too long ago. The work is called True to Our Feelings. And he's sort of responding to the philosophical tradition, where typically emotions are treated as not really reflections of us. And so he's trying to redefine what passions are, what the emotions are, and their influence in our life, in a way trying to reestablish our responsibility for them. And so he is in conversation with people like Freud and more physical scientists, but also Sartre and what's his name, Descartes, addressing ideas of whether there is an internal self and whether the emotions are in the internal self, etc.
yeah, I like that. What was the name of it again?
Interesting.
The True to Our Feelings by Robert C. Solomon.
Cool beans.
We can also always work in the analytic response to philosophy.
That one would be a bit.
And it's not too tough. I think it's honestly a really, really, really easy book because Russell makes this thing where he genuinely wants to write in an understandable way. He doesn't want to be like all these continental pieces of shit who you write in a way where you can't understand half of what they're saying.
Okay, I'm picking up on some bias.
It also helps that he's like from the past 100 years, so we don't need to deal with interpretations and stuff. We're friendly.
Right.
Okay.
I honestly, I don't agree with half the shit he says. But I think that would make for some great discussion, right? Because he's not necessarily saying controversial things sometimes. But it's definitely a book that will touch upon everything that people want to talk about, right? You have the first chapter alone is man from without. Then you have the physical world. You have man from within, and then you have the universe, right? So like the big five of philosophy, right? So that way you're if 1 week